Go ahead.
So first of all, welcome everybody. I want to welcome you to our 22nd Siyum. This is our 22nd Massechet that we have learned through together, which should be a mark of pride. I think that Bava Metzia has been particularly difficult because of the backdrop between war and anti-Semitism and the world kind of going up in smoke before our eyes. The heavy-duty topics of Bava Metzia are also kind of, I don't know, I don't know if we gave them short shrift, but I think the fact that we made it through daf after daf is to everybody's credit here, and we thank you for keeping us on the straight and narrow. Um, okay, we have, as promised, a wonderful guest speaker, Tamar Marvin. You can see her amongst the squares. We'll introduce her properly when we get to that segment of what we want to talk about. Yordana, do you have any words you wanted to introduce about Bava Metzia?
I don't know. I feel like the Bubas are in a way blurring together for me. I don't know if other people are feeling that way. But I think, like you said, with the backdrop of everything else that's going on in the world, it feels so heavy to be spending time learning what feels like real intricacies of Jewish civil law. I guess on the one hand, it's hard to concentrate on, but on the other hand, there's something reassuring about it at the same time, sort of like listening to and learning day-to-day problems that don't feel so big or heavy all the time.
Right. I think that there's been something very grounding, and we've been saying this through the pandemic, right? That the regimen of learning Daf Yomi has been helpful in that way. But I think that this material that kind of takes us out of our current reality to a historical recognition of law that just has to be in place for society to function, for neighbors to function, for people who are renting and borrowing and all of the kinds of things that we've been talking about. I think it's been quite helpful in that way. Literally for taking us out of our current reality, at least mine. Um, in any case, we will at some point open this up to, feedback from all of you if you have insights you would like to share. But first, I would like to turn to Leanne. Um, for anybody who hasn't been here before, Leanne is our resident poet. She has graced us with another. She is about to grace us with another wonderful poem in summary of the Massechet, or in response, I guess, to the Massechet. Leanne, all yours.
Boker Tov, everybody. This is the 22nd Massechet, and I feel like I want and need to do one for every one of these. They're not all so very good, my poems, and they're not so good. So, I did the best I could. The best I could, and
Wait, we can't let that stand. Leanne, we love your poems. All of your poems.
So whatever, today's poem is just my own little piece of trying to understand these babas. So for better or for worse, here we go. Fine print. Stuffed into drawers, hidden into rusty file cabinets, crumpled notes, stuffed into forgotten shelves, clipped and banded, bound volumes lining shelves, patiently waiting until needed. Fine print has time on its side. Legalese packed with hypotheticals, circumstantials, suppositionals. Big words, real problems, some simple and some difficult to imagine. Solutions appear in the fine print. When tos, where tos, how tos, why tos, too. Who belongs to what belongs to who, why and when, who deserves, whose fault, who owes, who pays, who gets, who gives, what is fair, and most certainly what is not. What's mine, what's yours, and why? Peer in. You'll find floors and ceilings, lost and found, fields and marketplaces, pets and pantries, loans and interest, families, businesses, rich and poor, people, you and me out there in the world. It's the fine print. The fine print passes over you like a puff of wind, unseen, yet it answers the questions. And sometimes, simply, oddly, there is no answer at all. It's waiting for another day. Fine print irrelevant until it's not. So small, the print is barely visible, and one peers, eyes so close to the page, searching in that whirlwind of words for answers hidden in plain sight, if we can just find them. Someone bothered to write it down, word for word, phrase for phrase, letter for letter, scratches on papyrus or a leather-bound volume. Each of us owns and sometimes needs fine print. It will not dazzle you, but you just might find your life hidden there. And that's it.
Thank you. That was fabulous. You always seem to make artistic sense of these Masechtot, especially these last few ones. So we all really, really appreciate that. And yes, as some people are writing here that your poems are really the highlight of the Siyum, which I think Anne and I very strongly agree with. I also just want to make note here, Deborah Salomon, who's also been listening to us from the beginning, just mentioned to us that her son was just called back this morning to the Army. So we just wish him that he stays safe and comes back safe. Obviously we're praying for all of our Chatufim to be returned, those who have been injured to be healed, and for all of our soldiers to be kept safe, and that, you know, everywhere in the world, our leaders sort of direct us in a good and peaceful direction. Okay, Anne, I'll hand
To all that. Let's pin. I'm gonna pin you, Tamar. Tamar Marvin. I'll first introduce you and then I'll pin you. Tamar Marvin, Dr. Tamar Marvin, Rabbanit Dr. Tamar Marvin, is here with a lot of credentials, as you hear. She's got a doctorate in Jewish history. She's recently completed the Maharat program in New York. She herself lives in California, but will be making Aliyah this summer. We are looking forward to welcoming you on the Israel side of things. And she is here to give us some perspective on the Jewish history that I think was kind of is implicit in a lot of what we've been talking about, the issues that show up within within the Masechet. So I also want to make note of before we turn it over to you, Tamar, she has a wonderful newsletter that perhaps, Tamar, you'll start with that. Tell everybody what the newsletter is about, because I feel like we have a cohort here that might really want to sign on. We'll ask you to put we'll put the information in the chat and so on, about Jewish history, about the Rishonim, about the scholars and the sages, not just of the pages of the Gemara, but throughout Jewish history. So without further ado, Tamar.
So hi, everyone. You can all hear me?
We can hear you.
Excellent. Excellent. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's amazing to see people from so many places. So good early morning to all the West Coasters. I saw that there was a number of us. Good slightly later morning to the East Coasters. And good afternoon, evening to the Israelis and anyone in between. Happy middle of the day. I wish I had time to go around and hear a little bit about each of your stories, but it's wonderful just to see you all here. Thank you, Anne, for the introduction. I wanted to add just a little word of introduction, and I'll tell you about my newsletter. It fits in. So in my family, we have a joke. I'll be talking about someone, and my family member or friend will say, "Are you talking about your medieval friend or your real friend?" So the period that I studied was the Middle Ages and the early modern period, which is about the years 500 to, depending how you divide it up, but something like 1750. I really think of the medieval people as my personal friends, and so that's how the joke goes in my family. You're talking about your medieval friend now. And in my newsletter, I try to kind of bring that aliveness to history. I do series. Right now, I'm doing a series on the history of Kabbalah. It's a new kind of series that delves into kind of more Jewish thought and intellectual history, which is my kind of mainstay. So I'm not actually a social an economic historian, but I was trained by some. So I will share with you some socioeconomic history today, which is the background to all the learning that you've been doing. So to say a word just about your learning, I just finished my time in yeshiva, as Anne said, and I just started my own learning in Shas. I hope to complete it in about 10 years. We'll see. So I'm in Massechet Bava. You're already in Bava Metzia, which is super impressive. I can't wait to get to it because it's very nerdy stuff that I love. There's a good reason, by the way, that the Bavas blend together. That's because historically speaking, they were one Massechet called Nezikin. It got so big and unwieldy that it was divided somewhat arbitrarily into 10 Prakim, 10 chapters each. So it's perfectly fine that it blends together in your mind. And I'd like to show you how it was kind of received and used and how it influenced Jewish life in the Middle Ages, which is, I think, particularly relevant, unfortunately, to today because it has so much to do with the medieval basis of anti-Semitism, as we'll see. And so I made a source sheet for you guys, and we don't have enough time for me to go source by source. So I just wanted to drop it in the chat for you in case you're the kind of person who likes to follow along and have the words in front of you. But I'm just going to be talking through these sources.
Tamar,
And kind of
you can share it if you want, but I gave you sharing privileges.
Oh, great. Okay, so I put it in the chat and hopefully the permissions that I've set will work. You'll tell me if they don't work and I'll fiddle with it a little bit more. But I wanted to start with terminology. I'm sure that you guys did a lot of work with terminology because it's so important to the subject. So we're concentrating today. I know Bava Metzia has a number of subjects in it. So this is about the topic of lending at interest, which became so controversial in the Middle Ages. So I'm sure that you're familiar with some of this terminology because it comes up so much. But I wanted to give you a medieval perspective on these two terms that occur in the Sukkim, in the verses of Tanakh, that discuss interest in a very negative light. One of them is neshech, and the other is tarbit or marbit, which becomes the rabbinic word that you see in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, ribit. So these two words are, as you saw, because I looked up the sources that you learned and they're so interesting, that there's a discussion, are they two separate terms? Do they mean the same thing? Do they mean a different kind of interest? So here, this is in Rashi. So Rashi lives in mostly in the 12th century, in the 11th century. And he has this is from his commentary on the Tanakh. So this is not from his commentary on the Talmud, but on the Tanakh. And he's explaining what this biblical term neshech means. And he says, it is called neshech, biting, from neshech, which is still, our completely normal modern word for biting, because it resembles the bite of a snake. It bites, inflicting a small wound in a person's foot, which he does not feel at first. But all at once, it swells and distends the whole body up to the top of his head. So it is with interest. First, one does not feel the drain it makes on him, and it remains unnoticed until the interest mounts up and suddenly makes the person lose a big fortune. And he's quoting the Midrash, as Rashi does in his commentary, but he's also giving us a window into how even in the probably late 11th century, there was a very negative Jewish view of lending at interest. We'll see, this was pervasive throughout both of the major societies in which Jews lived. So that's kind of he gives us both it's called ribit, that's the rabbinic word for it, and it's damaging. And then I wanted to talk about another terminology word that's really important here, which is usury. So usury is an English word via French post the Norman conquest. And it's also fundamentally, because it's an English word, a Christian term for lending money at interest. In its kind of like simple definition, it just refers to lending money at interest. In its more pejorative connotation, it refers to lending money at excessive interest. And this is something which Jews were widely and broadly accused of doing in the later Middle Ages. So a more kind of neutral term is money lending, right? The practice of lending money at interest. And that's the term that I'm mostly going to be using today, but you should know of that kind of baggage that usury holds as we have this discussion. So there's, in the Middle Ages, just as there is in the Gemara, there's this continued tension between the prohibition on lending at interest, which is pretty explicit in the ancient sources, especially in Tanakh, and the economic reality that made such loans necessary and also profitable, which was already present in the time of Chazal, of the rabbis who wrote the Talmud, and very much continues in the lives of the Rishonim. So this tension was not just present within the Jewish tradition, but also within Islam and Christianity. And those were the two big kind of spheres in which medieval Jews lived. Both of them, both Islam and Christianity, formally forbid the practice of lending at interest and regard it as morally reprehensible, not only sort of financially exploitative, but morally reprehensible, and in particular, unnatural. And this comes from actually ancient precedents. In particular, Aristotle argues, and he says this interestingly in his Ethics, right? So in a book about morality, he says that unlike natural processes like growth and decay, interest is artificial, it's not real, and it's thus morally problematic. And this is really a heritage that suffuses the medieval world. So within the Jewish world, those authorities who argue for the necessity of lending at interest and who find ways of circumventing this kind of seemingly blanket prohibition, which we'll look at a little bit more, we're also very much at pains, like they're very aware that they're circumventing something, that they need to work hard to get around it. So it's an awareness that always stands in the background. So I wanted to bring you a number of sources from the period of the Rishonim, from the Middle Ages up to the period in which, the early modern period in which the Jewish law is sort of codified into a code that's almost universally accepted, that speak to some of these tensions. So one very interesting thing that we see, so Rambam, or Maimonides, who lives in the 12th century, he dies in 1204, he wrote a book that is a list, an enumeration of all the biblical commandments. And he divided them into, in a traditional way, into positive and negative commandments. And his positive commandment, number 198, actually says that it is a positive mitzvah, it's a mitzvah taseh, to lend at interest to non-Jews. So as you saw that there, I'm sure in your learning, there's a distinction made already in the Psukim, in the Tanakh, between lending to Jews versus lending to non-Jews. And he formulates the distinction as actually one of obligation. And he explains, this is so that we do not benefit him or help him, meaning the non-Jew. And even when its content is such that he gives it to him in such a way as was prohibited to do with a Jew. So this is a very strong statement. It's echoed by some others, notably Ralbag, who is a pretty ardent follower of Rambam, that it's actually sort of morally positive to do this. these kinds of ideas obviously give rise to a lot of tensions between Jews and Christians. In practice, we'll see the situation was a lot more complicated. So compare what Rambam just said in his Sefer HaMitzvot, in his book on the commandments, to what he says in his code of law. So this is in Mishneh Torah. He has a section, a book about the laws of lending and borrowing, and he says, our sages, however, forbade a Jew from lending money to a Gentile at a fixed rate of interest beyond what is necessary for him to earn his livelihood. So when it comes to actual law, he puts this restriction on it. Only what you absolutely must charge an interest. They enacted this decree lest the lender learn from the Gentile's deeds as a result of the larger extent of his contact with him. So this was also an idea that comes up in the Talmud, right? That only people who are not going to be kind of influenced by the act of lending an interest because it's morally dangerous should be permitted to do so. And this is echoed in the medieval code of the Rambam. So he says Torah scholars will not learn from a Gentile's conduct. Hence, it is permitted for them to lend money to a Gentile at interest, even to make a profit. Any transaction in the category of the shade of interest that involves Gentiles are permitted for everyone. So that's his ultimate decision, which is actually a lot less strong than his kind of theoretical discussion. Then we jump ahead into the next century, and we see that there is definitely a changing reality. So Rambam, of course, lives in the Islamic world, but in Christian Europe, there was already a shift to finding ways to allow for money lending. I'll talk a little bit about why that happens specifically there. But for now, just to note the words of the Tosafot. So the Tosafot are a commentary on the Talmud. I don't know if you had a chance to encounter them. They're really fun to read because they almost extend the discussion in the Talmud. And there's a hand comment in a long Tosafot that deals primarily with the law. And this is what it says. Today, people usually lend money on interest to Gentiles because we have to pay taxes to the king and princes, and everything serves to sustain ourselves. Right? We need it for our livelihood. Otherwise, we can't make ends meet. We live among the nations, and it is impossible for us to earn a living unless we deal with them. It is therefore no more forbidden to lend at interest because one might learn from their deeds, right? Because one might be influenced by this bad moral behavior. So it's no more forbidden than it is to engage in any other business. So this is in France, in the approximately 12th and 13th centuries. We see that it's widely practiced. And then there's another comment that we see. This is in the 14th century, Menachem Meiri, who lived in the south of France. And he goes maybe even a little bit further than Tosafot and says, in our days, nobody cares about refraining from business dealings with the loans to Gentiles, even on their festivals. Not a Gaon, not a rabbi, not a scholar, not a pupil, not a chassid, so not even a very pious person, and not one who pretends to be a chassid. All these laws refer only to idolaters and their images, but all transactions with Christians are perfectly legal. So one of the ways that Meiri gets around the seeming prohibition is to say the restriction is not against those people who are, he takes Christians out of the category of idolaters and makes them just kind of law-abiding people with whom this transaction can be made. And this idea that Meiri has that the laws of the ancient laws about idolaters don't apply to Christians is developed by others, by Joseph Albo, who is a Spanish philosopher, by Maharic from France in the later parts of the Middle Ages. And then when we get to the Shulchan Aruch, which is the kind of definitive code of Jewish law that becomes accepted once there's some glosses added to it, it becomes acceptable both to Ashkenazi and to Sephardi Jews. And in it, we have the beginnings of something that will come to be in the modern era. So after my period, in the 18th century, which is an official workaround that recasts a lender as an investor. That makes a really big halachic difference because once you're an investor, you bear some risk and you're not lending it interest, you're investing. And that's the kind of deal that eventually will become the standard way of getting around the problem of lending it interest. So just in the last part of my talk, I wanted to kind of clue you into a really fascinating historians debate, which talks about the actual conditions of Jewish life and how sort of the anti-Jewish attitudes that have to do with money lending came to be. So because in the Islamic world, Jews tended to have a wider variety of professions, this debate pertains to the Ashkenazi world. So in Ashkenaz, which is in its larger connotation means the whole of Northern Europe, Northern and Central Europe, really is not settled by Jews continuously the way that the Mediterranean world is, right? So in Italy and in Greece and in Iberia, which includes Spain and Portugal today, Jews lived continuously from antiquity. But there were some Jews who lived in Germany, which was then a province of the Roman Empire, but they did not live there continuously. What we see in the Middle Ages, beginning in the 9th century, is that Jews begin moving into Ashkenaz based on individual charters of settlement, which allow them to do particular things, mostly trade-related things. So the very first Jews who arrive in what will become Germany and northern France are coming as people who deal with money in goods. So that is very sort of foundational to the community. Their right to settle in those lands is based on the economic need of the local rulers or sometimes the king, the even larger ruler, for their financial services or their mercantile activity. So that's a very different kind of situation that happens in Ashkenaz. In addition, we have this problem in Ashkenaz where Jews when they enter into these societies, they're living kind of outside of the framework that Christian society has for itself. So they're not, of course, they're not landed nobility. They're not eligible to be nobility as non-Christians. However, they're also not peasant land tenants, right? So they are somewhat outside of the system that exists. They're immigrants. Their assets tend to be liquid, so not tied up in real estate, right? So they have the ability to lend money more so than many Christians, although the Christian mercantile class is developing at this point. Another thing happens, beginning in the 1100s, Christian canon law, which is the law developed by the church, increasingly formally prohibits lending money at interest. At the same time as these laws begin to come out and formalize the restriction, Jews are shut out of many of the professional guilds that are developing. They're also subject to increasing tax burdens. There are some historians who argue that Jews were also restricted legally and socially in their ability to become landowners. Others push back on that, but it seems that Jews have a narrowing ability to make a living, and money lending becomes a common profession. So earlier historians argued that this actually created a situation in which a notable majority of Jews in Ashkenaz were forced into money lending. And the medieval Jewish community of England, which was a very small community and offshoot of the French community, was the most extreme example of this, with a lot of money lending activity. And the public and religious Christian outcry against Jewish usury was linked to expulsions, the first of which was indeed from England in 1290. Often the monarchs who expelled Jews were very happy to assume the loans of Jews in exchange for capitulating to this public pressure, ecclesiastical pressure. And so the monarch would end up gaining a lot of revenue by coming to hold the monies that were owed to Jews. More recently, there's historians who have argued against this picture. They suggest that Jews were not forced into money lending, but chose this profession due to its expediency and profitability, combined with their unique circumstances. So this group of kind of like newer historians argue that there is extensive documentary evidence of Christians also lending money at interest to other Christians, as well as to Jews throughout the medieval period, even the later one when it was technically illegal. And often the Christian lenders lent at worse terms for the person to whom they were lending, i.e. they lent at higher interest at worse terms than were charged by Jewish moneylenders who were obliged to charge at lesser terms. And I think this is my position. I would argue for a kind of middle position in which anti-usury laws were responses to widespread practices of lending at interest, right? So when you see lots of laws saying, don't do this, usually means that people are doing it. That Jews were impelled by multiple and not exclusively legal forces towards the business of money lending, and that it did make them associated with and often hated for practice that was morally and legally condemned in all three of the major religions. And that's how we end up with a figure, right, in our literary imaginations of Shylock from The Merchant of Venice, who is an uncompromising money lender who wants his pound of flesh just because he can get it, in a kind of vindictive and amoral way, the way that Shakespeare depicts him. Shakespeare himself probably did not know any Jews because there were no Jews in England. They were expelled and had not been readmitted at that time. But that was the perception that he was working with. So unfortunately, it's had a very negative impact on Jewish-Christian relations, and is to this day something of an anti-Semitic trope. So we still have work to do to progress beyond it. So that's the presentation that I have for you, and I'm so happy to take any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you, Tamar. I think that really filled in exactly what Anne and I were hoping that you would share with everybody, sort of this, bridging between learning in Bava Metzia, how much we're not supposed to doing interest, and sort of knowing that historically that is something that Jews did participate in. Does anybody have any questions? You can either raise your hand or just jump in or put it in the chat. Anyone? Okay, Jason wrote, I really appreciate the reframing of usury to investment.
That's called, it becomes called in Jewish law, heter iska. And it's like still a thing that people do. There's like a formal, Jewish organizations that have suggested ways to do it. It gets very complicated, very Talmudic. And it restructures things kind of as a partnership, and the investor or the lender has to kind of be paid a symbolic sum for their management and that kind of thing. Yes. There's, I'm actually really interested now that I've looked into the topic. Hopefully I will be getting a mortgage in Israel someday, soonish, to see if there's any kind of like Heteri sky involved in it.
Right. So just to remind everybody that a
There
heteri
is, there
is an
is.
arrangement that the Talmud does talk about, right? There was in Bava Metzia a lot of discussion about people who were in partnership together, where one person was doing the funding and the other person was sort of doing the work or selling the goods. And there was a lot of discussion what happens if one person, if somebody wants to exit the partnership, and how that would work if it was at a loss and who's responsible for that loss. So it's sort of taking another Talmudic term or another Talmudic arrangement and saying, well, that's, this is the way that we could apply this to business today and to investment today. Right. So Jason wrote here that we couldn't buy Israel bonds. Right. And Rachel here wrote, thank you for your thoughtful presentation. Thanks always for compiling and sharing your source sheet. We'll send that out again to everybody. Any other questions?
Here I see Laura writes, can you talk more about money lending internally in the Jewish community in the medieval period? Were there specific institutions?
Great question. I don't know so much about the mechanics of loans that were made from Jews to Jews. But one thing that we do know about medieval loans, and this actually explains some of the kind of like invective against them, is that they tended to be on much higher percentages than we see today. So it was not uncommon to see loans at like 43%, 60% interest. This was probably because loan terms were much shorter than today. So for example, if a person is going to be repaying their loan in a week or a month, the interest they accrue, even though it's high in terms of its percentage, is not high in terms of the actual money that they have to turn over. So it's possible that kind of internal loaning also relied on these short loaning periods to make it less problematic not to charge interest. There were obviously cases in which Jews availed themselves of loans at interest that were held by Christians to circumvent this prohibition. But it's a question that I don't really know the answer to. How did Jews lend to each other at interest? What was the mechanism that they used?
And now, Batsheva, how do we respond to the challenge that our Heter Iska reinforces the stereotypes that Jews will find a way to make money? Right, that this is a allegation against Jews according to those stereotypes that you were talking about.
Yeah. So, and you've encountered that in informal conversation, which is really concerning, right? I think that it actually, if you look at the mechanics of a heter iska, it actually creates, because it creates an investor relationship, it gives the lender some powers that they wouldn't otherwise have. So I think that that's one way to get around it. It's also comes from a place of wanting to prevent the taking of interest, which is by now a completely normal and non kind of ethically charged practice in our society. So really a heter iska is something that tries very hard to take seriously the biblical notion that interest is something that you have to do with a lot of care, if at all. And the sort of Talmudic background that says that limits it to very certain circumstances. And it's really an attempt to continue to adhere to that kind of morality, even at a time when we have really moved past that. So that might be one way that you go about kind of explaining it. Oh, so did Jewish money lenders transition into banking after the medieval period. So actually, in there were banks very
Right.
early on in the Islamic world. But in the Christian world, in Christian Europe, yes, once in the early modern period, once banking really developed, it started in Italy. Jews were always involved in that as much as they could be. And the times were also involved with the in different ways with working with the Christian banking families. So that is definitely something that we see, yes.
Tamar, I have a different kind of question. Did you
Yeah.
come across anything that addresses how far removed the practice was in the Middle Ages as compared to the way it's delineated in the Talmud? I understand that there's citation and reference back, but does anybody make this observation that it's a really different kind of practice?
So it's interesting. I would say that they argue not so much that it's a different practice, but that circumstances have changed, right? So that the world in which Jews are living now doesn't allow them to avoid it. It's something that they are kind of have no choice but to engage in order to make a living. There's also, they developed the idea that everybody is learned enough, everyone is enough of a scholar that they won't learn from the ways of non-Jews in a negative sense. And then there's also that idea developed that the non-Jews that we're dealing with are not the same as the ones that exist, that were pagans and idolaters that existed in the past. So it's really, the way they do it is to change the circumstances around and less to try to change the prohibition itself.
That seems like a very modern approach also.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Tamar. And I hope we'll have an opportunity to learn with you again. If you could drop in the chat or at least just send us, and we'll send it out to everybody later, how people can sign up for your newsletter. Because I think a lot of people will be interested in joining that and receiving that from you. Okay. So with that, we are going to actually finish up the Massechet and learn the end of the Massechet together. And let me know if you're gonna end it, and I'll say the Hadron this time.
Yes, thank you for that. From the last page, Rabbi Shimon Kol Elyon Yachol Lifshot. That's a citation from the Mishnah, where Rabbi Shimon says that any vegetable produce that the owner of the upper garden, right? We're talking about the gardens of two residents, neighbors who have an upper and a lower. If the owner of the upper garden can reach out his hand and just take those vegetables then they are his, and the rest would belong to the owner of the lower garden. The Gemara says, Kol shel yon yachol lifshot. I'm sorry, the Gemara goes on to say, Amri Rabbi Debei Rabbi Yanai, ubilvad shelo ye'anes, as long as he doesn't have to force himself, right? He's not stretching and reaching and doing gymnastics to be able to reach these vegetables. By Rav Anan va'itema Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rav Anan, or maybe it was Rabbi Yirmiyah, raises a dilemma on this. Megia legufo ve'en megia likaro, megia likaro ve'en megia lenofo. What if he could only reach the leaves but not the roots? What if he could only reach the roots but not the leaves? Does that count as being able to reach the vegetable that he has the right to take them? And the Gemara concludes here at the very end of the Massechet, no less, or I guess you could say at the end of the middle third of the whole of Nezikin, with the Teku, right? This is unresolved, and the idea is that Eliyahu one day will come and give us the answer. Amar Ephraim Safra Talmido Shel Rish Lakish Mishum Rish Lakish. The scribe, Ephraim the scribe, who was a student of Rish Lakish and also his scribe, said the following in the name of Rish Lakish, Halacha Rabbi Shimon. We should paskin like Rabbi Shimon, Rish Lakish did. Amrua Kamed de Shavor Malka. This was stated in the case before the Persian king Shapur Malka. I guess in English he's Shapur, but in the Hebrew it's spelled Shavur. We talked a bit about him on the podcast. Amar lahu Iparyon nimtei Rabbi Shimon. he says, let's offer praise, a period, to Rabbi Shimon. He liked that resolution. The fact that there's a Persian king weighing in on the psak of how best neighbors should be pulling their vegetables is an interesting discussion. As Yardain, I think this was really you on the podcast, as we've already raised. Hadran alach habayit v'aliyah, Masilkala Massechet Bava Metzia.
Hadran alach Massechet Bava Metzia, v'hadrach alan. Datach alam Massechet Bava Metzia, v'datan alat. Lo nishne minach Massechet Bava Metzia, v'lo tinashe minan, lo ba'am hadim, v'lo ba'am da'ate. Yihur tzom lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'lohei avotenu, shetehei toratecha emunatenu, v'alam hazeh, utehei imanu le'olam haba. Chanini bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba Mari bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surcha bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Dar bar Papa. Harevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratcha b'pinu v'piyot amcha be'Yisrael. V'nehayet kulanu anachnu v'tzetzainu v'tzetza'ei amcha be'Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei toratecha lishma. May oivai t'chameni mitzvotecha ki li'olam hili. Yihili bitamim b'chukacha l'man lo yibosh. Li'olam lo ashkach b'kudacha ki bam chiyatani. Baruch atah Adonai lamdeni chukacha. Amen, amen, amen. Sela v'ed. Modim anachnu lach Adonai Eloheinu v'lei avotenu shesamta chalkenu miyoshvei beit hamidrash v'lo samta chalkenu miyoshvei karnot. She'anu mashkemim v'hei mashkemim. Anu mashkemim l'divrei Torah v'hei mashkemim l'divrei b'telim. Anu amelim v'hei amelim. Anu amelim mekablim schar v'hei amelim v'einam mekablim schar. Anu ratzim v'hei ratzim. Anu ratzim l'chayei olam haba v'hei ratzim l'ver shachat she'amar v'ata Elohim toridem l'ver shachat anshei damim u'mirma lo yachatzu yimeim v'ani avtach bach. Yiratzon v'nach Adonai Eloheinu k'shem she'azartanu l'sayim Massechet Bava Metzia kein ta'azarnu l'hatchil masechtot isfarim acharim u'l'samim l'mod u'lamed l'shmor v'lasod u'l'kayim ekol divrei Talmud toratecha b'yava u'zuchut kol ha'tanaim v'amorim v'talmidei chachamim ya'amod lanu l'zarenu shelo tamosh ha'torah mipinu u'mipi zarenu v'zera zarenu ad olam v'titkayim banu v'hitalechecha tanecha otcha v'shivchacha tishmor alecha v'haktsiota hi tisecha kivi yirbu yamecha v'yosivu l'cha shnot chayim orech hamim v'minal v'smolo osher v'chavod Adonai oz le'amo yitain Adonai yivarech etamo v'shalom. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I think we're not going to see you till November.
December. It's mid-December.
December. It's like Bava Batra is the longest of the Bava, so it's very, very long. It's like 178 Tafim.
But we look forward to seeing you then. And we're, of
Everybody-
course, always here for comments and questions in the meantime.
And have a great summer, everybody. And hopefully the next time we'll see you, there will be a lot of good news to share.
Amen.